The Young and the Restless Spoilers. In Los Angeles, where reinventions are currency and names can be costumes slipped on before breakfast, the rumor began as a whisper in a studio parking garage and swelled into a siren that cut through both coasts. An identity thief had been unmasked, and the mask might have been sewn to the skin. The story traced backward through glittering investor decks and curated charity galas to a single, blunt possibility that made every handshake retroactively feel like a crime scene. Matt Clark might have killed the real Mitch Bacall before stealing his life, his company's, his wife, and his second chance. What made the scandal unbearable wasn't only the violence implied, but the psychological vertigo described by those who had watched Mitch assemble himself in public. Here was a man who didn't merely inhabit a role but metabolized it until the role began to devour whatever was left of the actor. The first fracture appeared in the unlikeliest place, tucked inside a routine licensing dispute, when a paralegal noticed that the earliest Bacall signatures preceding a sudden capital infusion into a hospitality tech roll-up were sprawled with the loose confidence of a man at ease, while the later signatures tightened into the small, diligent handwriting of someone trying to pass an exam. From there the pattern spidered into everything. The shift in musical tastes defended as refinement, the new allergy to childhood anecdotes explained as privacy, the aversion to spontaneous reunions reframed as burnout. Each substitution made sense in isolation, together they formed a confession written across time. The more that forensic accountants and private investigators pulled at the thread, the more the thread seemed to be the fabric, and far away in Genoa City, where the cost of forgetting had always been paid with interest, people who knew the name Matt Clark felt their stomachs drop as the silhouette of his old war with the Newmans reappeared behind the California sun. Sharon remembered the ruin, Nick remembered the rage, and both recognized the precision of the current storm, an affair that could be exploited, a son whose accident on a canyon road could be disguised as physics rather than intent, a wife named Sienna who might never be sure whether she was loved or curated. For months, Sienna had rationalized the unease as stage fright, telling herself that marriage to a man who constantly reinvented himself comes with vertigo, that the prickling sensation of being observed in her own house was nothing but the price of living with someone whose mind never stopped solving, sorting, surveilling. The first time she saw his eyes go empty in a mirror, no sorrow, no fury, just a quiet recalibration, she told herself it was exhaustion. The 10th time, she began to suspect she was witnessing an algorithm considering whether an input was redundant. What made her doubt solidify into terror was not a threat or a confession but the careful way he managed her grief after Noah's crash, gloved hands around the edges of her panic, kindness that felt measured rather than humane, the strange attention he paid to the sequence of her sentences, as if parsing them for metadata. She had never known Matt Clark, not as he had once been, not as the scorched-earth adversary who carved scars across the Newman family history, but she knew the cadence of men who needed to be right more than they needed to be real, and she understood too late that she had married a conclusion rather than a man. In Genoa City, Nick rebuilt the accident minute by minute, trading sleep for certainty until the ordinary cruelty of weather and speed fell away and only intention remained. He found residue of a solvent on a component that should not have seen solvent, learned the name of a mechanic who had been paid by an LLC that existed for 3 weeks, stared at financials until the pattern of Mitch's travels synced with small absences that coincided with instrumental days, all of it amounting to a calculus he recognized from other wars. Whoever hurt his family this time had done it neatly, and everyone who does anything neatly makes a mistake somewhere. The mistake, when it surfaced, was oddly tender. An old landlord in the arts district, a man who framed black and white photographs for a living, who remembered the day a previous tenant named Mitch stopped by to ask about a crate of film cameras that never arrived, who remembered precisely because Mitch wrote him a postcard a month later from Big Sur, apologizing for the confusion and promising to settle the balance when his next consulting fee cleared. The postcard, when recovered, was dated a week after the real Mitch's phone stopped moving and his bank account began interacting with a different routine, one that preferred cash and wrote fewer vowels. Big Sur was wide water and punishing cliffs, a place where an argument could become a eulogy in the time it takes a tire to slip, And the Coastal Patrol report that had once been classified as incomplete suddenly grew fangs when cross-referenced against 17 minutes of missing dashcam footage from a rental car invoice that never initially hit the insurance carrier's database. In Los Angeles, reporters learned to pronounce Genoa City again, and in Genoa City, people who vowed never to pronounce Matt Clark again found themselves saying Mitch in a lower voice. The hinge that made everything open wasn't a corpse or a confession. It was the psychology that the actor Roger Howarth described in an interview that nobody paid attention to until it sounded like deposition. If a man pretends long enough, he begins to learn everything about the person he pretends to be, and if knowing everything is indistinguishable from being, then the pretense becomes ontology. That was why attempts to confront Mitch failed. Arguments about facts bounced off a theology. He wasn't lying when he said he was Mitch. He was protecting a religion he had built out of stolen furniture. The danger of a faith that intense is that it cannot tolerate heresy, and once Sienna's sorrow began turning toward suspicion, she became a blasphemer in her own house. She tried to leave once, in the ordinary way a person imagines flight, bags in a car, a credit card in another name, but the routineness of it offended the sophistication of the machine, and the exit dissolved into inconveniences that multiplied like mirrors. A fraudulent alert on a card, a sudden compliance hold at a bank, a concerned visit from a security consultant who spoke softly about stalker risks and recommended, for her safety, that she not post her travel plans. Each favor landed as a feather, together they were a lead blanket. She did not call Nick, she remembered the accident and did not trust the air around her. Instead, she began to collect the small hypocrisies that every liar leaves behind. The reused alias recycled 1 inch too close to a previous incognito, the burner number that appeared in a boutique's order history because the sales clerk entered it for a same-day hold, the misremembered anecdote that kneecapped an origin story rehearsed 1,000 times. None of it proved murder, all of it proved fiction. The break came when a foundation Mitch chaired issued a grant to a startup whose cap table included an entity that matched, almost but not quite, the Delaware shell used to pay the canyon mechanic. The difference was a single character in the name. The kind of error that only happens when a man moves too fast between hiding places. From there, the path to Big Sur brightened, and the ocean ceased to be a metaphor and returned to work as evidence. Law enforcement will call it probable cause. In the city's collective memory it would be remembered as the moment the ocean gave a story back. No body surfaced, but a wetsuit did, purchased in a size that matched the real Mitch and found trapped beneath a shelf of rock where fishermen rarely cast, the neoprene slashed by something that looked less like sea damage and more like a knife that changed its mind. A rental receipt in the wetsuit's pocket bore the date that postcard was sent, and a grain of sand embedded in the cardboard thread matched the strand where the Coast Patrol filed the incomplete report. In the absence of a corpse, murder stayed a word prosecutors could not use, but identity theft no longer needed poetry, and the state could do math. While the district attorneys negotiated with the tide, Nick did something the tide could not. He spoke to the pattern in its native language, leverage. He found a banker hungry enough to confess what offshore screens keep clean, traded favors until the cap table bloomed like mold in a time-lapse, and prepared to drag Mitch from the sunlight of curated entrepreneurship back into the shadow from which he dragged his name. The irony, exquisite and cruel, is that by then Mitch was already negotiating a second reinvention, because a religion that cannot tolerate heresy must relocate its heaven. He began speaking about relocation in terms of wellness and creative renewal, laughing lightly when asked about Genoa City as if the place were myth. He told friends that the brand had outgrown the venue and the heart must follow the brand. He did not reckon with the stubbornness of love, which recognizes the scent of the wolf no matter the cologne, and he did not reckon with Sienna's decision to stop being admired and start being believed. She met with an attorney in a church basement where no one checked names, handed over a ledger of small, boring sins stitched into a tapestry that made glamorous crimes plausible, and said the sentence people always say too late, it was never supposed to go this far. In truth, it had always been this far. The distance was baked into the first theft, and what followed was physics. As Los Angeles debated whether a man can become another man by force of will, Genoa City remembered that will without conscience is simply force. Sharon sat in her kitchen with grief that tasted familiar. Nick stood and did not shake. Noah practiced breathing like it was a class, and the family braced for a second season of a show they thought had been cancelled. The warrant did not say murder. It said fraud and conspiracy and a collection of financial felonies dressed in evening wear, and it moved swiftly because money is louder than blood. The arrest was not cinematic. It felt like an accountant's calendar appointment that left the room in handcuffs. Through counsel, Mitch expressed disappointment at a system unable to distinguish success from suspicion, and the markets did what they always do when the truth arrives late: they priced in the lie. Partners distanced themselves with language that could be pasted into any press release. Boards convened extraordinary sessions where admiration converted to risk management. The story the public consumed was about the identity theft. The private story, the one that sat in Sienna's bones and in Nick's clenched jaw, was about the violence of curation. The way a man can edit a life so aggressively that people become props and love becomes an instrument. Whether the ocean would ever yield a body remained the unanswerable question, but the city no longer needed the corpse to understand the crime. In a courthouse with bad lighting, a judge garnished the illusion with conditions, and the man who preferred skylines to ceilings stared at a clock. The final twist did not roar, it landed like a diagnosis. A forensic linguist compared the Big Sur postcard to early Bacall emails and matched the micro-habits of a writer who had studied another man too well, the same invisible tells that had tightened those later signatures. It was not proof of murder, it was proof of obsession, the kind that escalates until the object disappears or the subject does. When the filings were unsealed, Los Angeles did what it always does, turned the catastrophe into content, and Genoa City did what it always does, took inventory of the damage and prepared to fight again. Sienna learned that surviving love can look like betrayal from far away and like courage up close. Nick learned that sometimes the only way to end a war is to refuse the next battle and hand the ammunition to the law. Sharon learned that the human heart is an expert forger but still keeps the original signature in a drawer. And the man who once insisted that he was Mitch Bacall learned that there is a difference between wearing a name and being the person everyone believes when they hear it. If there is a moral, it is not the neat one about truth triumphing. It is the messier one about truth returning, late and unsentimental, to turn off the lights in a house built of borrowed mirrors. Somewhere, a coastal wind pushed night into another morning, and a city that sells beginnings woke to find that the newest beginning had been an ending all along. In a city that sells reinvention by the square foot and brands it as salvation, the most dangerous lie is the one that looks like mercy, and that was the problem with Mitch Bacall long before anyone learned that Mitch Bacall might not exist. Los Angeles had welcomed him because he arrived carrying all the right promises: capital for starving venues, creative oxygen for fading districts, a curated appetite for giving. Yet when the rumor surfaced that he was not a self-made man but a self-replaced one, even the sun seemed to stall over the canyons as if daylight itself wanted to confirm the paperwork, and what emerged was a hypothesis so elegant and so monstrous that both coasts held their breath. Matt Clark had not invented a mask, he had found a face, and the man whose face it was had vanished into the kind of silence that only the Pacific can teach. The logic was brutal and therefore believable. If you are Matt, relentless, charming when it serves you, vindictive when it must, steeped in ancient grievances against the Newmans and intoxicated by the mathematics of control, you do not trust chance, you stalk it until it looks like skill. You scan crowds and donor lists and angel syndicates for a target within your blood type of features, a man who resembles you closely enough that a haircut and the right jawline fatigue will do the rest, a man with plausible ties, a debt or two, a tendency to travel alone, a confidentiality clause buried in a failed startup, a hole in his origin story wide enough to slide a second life through. You offer him a friendship that tastes like helium, upward, weightless, flattering, and then you engineer a pressure change, a night of wet cliffs and bad visibility, or a boat trip with a drunk ocean, or a hiking trail that tilts into geology, and afterward the public record holds only what you have time to leave behind, a postcard in a careful hand, a final wire transfer to settle a conscience, and a witness who swears he heard the word goodbye spoken by a man who doesn't say goodbyes. The cruelty is not only the act, it is the understanding that human memory is a lossy compression, that if you feed the city enough high-resolution new images of Mitch, press photos, charity step-in repeats, panel discussions about hospitality tech and neighborhood equity, the low-resolution questions about where the real one went will become an aesthetic, not an inquiry. People will say the original Mitch faded, and you, who understand optics, will let them watch you sharpen into focus. What made this theory metastasize from gossip to doctrine was not a single smoking gun but a choreography of small mistakes that only exists when a brilliant liar begins to believe his own story. The signatures that tightened as if their muscles had learned fear. The shift from serifed pens to smooth gelled ones at the exact moment Mitch began speaking on panels about frictionless design. The sudden allergy to people who had known him before the rebrand, the overinvestment in a single boutique church that baptized adult converts with scented candles and gave them privacy boxes filled with new names for God. If Roger Howarth was correct in that casual interview, if a man who pretends long enough begins to know everything about the person he pretends to be until the knowledge itself becomes belief, then Matt's danger wasn't simply that he could pass as Mitch, it was that he could prosecute heresy. Every doubt became an offense, every question a crime. In Genoa City, where the Newmans have learned to recognize an incoming storm by the way the houseplants lean, Nick Newman mapped the night of his son's canyon crash using the only instruments that never lied to him, timelines and torque. He saw the brake assembly that failed without screaming, as if a precision tool had whispered death to it and taught it manners. He found an LLC that existed for the lifespan of a fruit fly and paid a mechanic who fled for a town nobody vacations in. He traced a burner number that went quiet whenever Mitch went loud. He did these things not because he loves puzzles but because he loves his son and because the last time Matt Clark came to town, love itself had to be rebuilt. Meanwhile, Sharon Newman, whose inventory of private grief makes most people's catastrophes look like errands, understood the pathology of men who curate reality. They don't kill because you defy them. They kill because you remind them there is a version of the world they do not edit, and that is an intolerable insult to an editor. Sienna understood this too, but late, which is when understanding is an injury rather than a skill. She had met Mitch the way people meet beautiful disasters, by mistaking velocity for purpose, and by the time she realized that his tenderness had gears, she had already dragged her furniture into his narrative and called it marriage. After Noah's crash she searched his face for unscripted grief and found instead a kind of management, hands that arranged her sorrow the way you arrange a vase before guests arrive, words that landed like measurements, attention that looked like love until you counted it. She wanted to be wrong about him because being right would mean every kiss had been factored into a budget. When she finally admitted to herself that she was afraid of him, the admission had no coordinates. Fear is a weather that colonizes you. She tried to leave and discovered that leaving requires an ecosystem. A card that works, a bank that believes you, a friend who can keep a secret longer than the algorithm can listen, and the algorithm around her seemed to have a name. The concierge who noticed a man in the lobby who notices everyone. The compliance hold that froze a transfer because someone somewhere had filed a concern for her safety. The locksmith who arrived quickly and asked, too gently, whether she had considered a panic room. None of these events were illegal, all of them were intentional. The cage was ethical design. What kept the rumor alive in Los Angeles was not the Newmans' paranoia but the aesthetics of Mitch's past tense. A landlord in a downtown arts building kept a postcard from Big Sur signed in a hand that tried too hard to look like leisure. A wetsuit without a body wedged itself under a lip of stone where the current prefers to stash secrets. A foundation grant placed a quiet investment into a quiet startup whose cap table contained an entity whose name differed from the mechanic's paymaster by a single character, which is the kind of forgery that a good man makes by accident and a bad man makes because he is moving. The cops called it insufficient, bloggers called it enough, private investigators called it a retainer. Through it all, Mitch smiled in long exposures, curated a vertical of restaurants that felt like sins confessing to architecture, and bought his way into the kind of philanthropy that launders not just money but narrative.